بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وشفيعنا وحبيبنا محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا ربنا زدنا علما نافعا آمين يا رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome all of our dear viewers to this new class that will be running from this week on the Karima Foundation YouTube channel, which is essentially a tafsir of Juz Amma and Surah Al-Fatiha, taken from a standalone work written by the great Tunisian Mufassir, whose image you can see right in front of you, Sheikh Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on him, who was the Shaykh al-Islam, the Grand Mufti of the Malikiya in Tunisia until his passing in the late 20th century. Well, not very late, but late enough. And inshallah ta'ala, in today's session, what we're going to do is just have a brief look at the life and times of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. I'm not an expert on him, nor am I an expert on the history of Tunisia, nor am I an expert on the period that we're speaking of, but I have some readings, and what we're going to do is just put forward an introduction on this topic, inshallah ta'ala, and we're going to give people indication towards further readings that they can access themselves and benefit from, inshallah ta'ala. But what I want to do primarily is try to unpack the life and times of this wonderful and incredible author whose name you probably have heard. If you've ever heard or listened to Durus on Quran, primarily you would have heard the name Ibn Ashur. And maybe you thought that this was one of the classical mufassirin from the time of Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi or al-Baydawi or al-Nasafi and the like. And you might be surprised to know that this is a man who was still alive on this planet around 50, 60 years ago, rahimahullah ta'ala, and is one of the modern scholars who reminded people of the great depth and genius that was prevalent in a previous age. And so you can see the images of him. There's a photo of him on the right, and then it looks to be some sort of painting of him on the left. And this is the man whose life and times we'll be speaking of. I will be taking most of my information from two primary, I was going to say primary sources, not primary sources in the technical sense, but they will be the primary sources for me. One is this paper, and both of these, oops, sorry, no, let's just go to this slide where I have both of them side by side. One is on the right-hand side, a paper written by Bashir Nafi', which is, I think, at this point in time, the only attempt anybody's made to write a biography of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur in the English language. And it's about 30 pages, and it's well, maybe less, about 25 pages of actual material. And he goes briefly through his life and his accomplishments, his positions that he held, some of the controversies that he faced. And also, he spends a decent amount of time unpacking the genius of the tafsir, what was the remarkable achievement of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, may Allah have mercy on him, with regards to the tafsir that he wrote, At-Tahrir wa Tanwir, to give it shorter name. But the majority of the material that we'll be presenting today is from the book on the left, Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur, علامة الفقه وأصوله والتفسير وعلومه, written by Iyad Khalid al-Taba', who I don't know if he's alive or who he is really, but he's the author of this work, and this is a series of books that you can still access, printed by Darul Qalam on various seminal figures from the modern period, and there are many ulama whose names are found in this series. And so if people want to read further, then I recommend that they go to these two sources. Now, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur is without a shadow of a doubt one of the great scholars of the 20th century, who wrote some absolutely phenomenal works, revitalized the science of Maqasid al-Sharia after it, in a sense, lay dormant for many centuries, wrote this magisterial tafsir work that people is like one of the indispensable works of tafsir. If I remember correctly, Sheikh Ali Hani, when he talks about his Ummuhat al-Tafasir, the great books of tafsir that you can't go without, you have to access to understand a verse. If I remember correctly, he puts the At-Tahrir wa Tanwir in his 8, that you have to read in order to truly understand verses of the Quran. You have to give Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur his due. He was a master jurist of the Maliki school. He was a muhaddith, which people forget, which we'll talk about briefly today. He was an expert in the Arabic language and all of the linguistic sciences. He was somebody who had an understanding of the science of kalam and the Ash'ari school, which he was more loyal to than any other school, though he had his own peculiarities. He was somebody who transcended the boxes, the configurations that many people try to put him in. He was a reformist. He was a modern scholar in the sense that he engaged in the world of modernity. He lived in the nation state of Tunisia. He lived under French colonialism. He lived under the rule of Bourguiba, who was the ruler or the president or prime minister or the dictator, I think, of Tunisia in his time. He was somebody who understood the challenges of the age that he was present in, but at the same time, he was an alim. He was somebody beholden and loyal to the tradition, the mirath of the Prophet ﷺ that he had inherited from his time as a student in the Zaytuna Madrasa in Tunisia, one of the great North African madaris. And he was somebody who defended the tradition impeccably in many, many instances, stood up in the face of intellectual pressure, political pressure, social pressure to defend Islam. And without a shadow of a doubt, as I've said already, he is one of the great scholars, one of the great Mujaddid scholars of the 20th century. And regardless of the fact that he has his peculiarities, there are certain positions that maybe the more strict orthodoxy may not comply with, but nevertheless, there's no denying that this man was an absolute genius. And if you read his works, and I can't say that I've read all of them, but I have spent some time with a few of them, you just walk out seeing that this was a man who was very confident, who knew that he had a grasp of the Islamic sciences and did not shy away from presenting what he felt was the truth. And so what we're going to explore today is his life and times, inshallah ta'ala. I have a lot of slides. I don't know how long this is going to take. There are areas that I am going to be able to expand on. There are other areas we're going to just look at very briefly and move on. And again, like I mentioned before, the books are available. For those who come out of this thinking, oh, I wasn't satiated, he didn't go into enough detail, he didn't really know what he was talking about, that's fine. You are more than welcome to go and access the books yourself. And for those of you who know me or have access to Karima, you can email Karima and ask them for the PDFs of both works, and I'm more than happy to send them over to people, inshallah ta'ala. So let's move on to looking at his life. Very briefly, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur in a nutshell is born in Tunisia in his grandfather's palace. So he's a man who comes from the aristocracy of Tunisia. He is from a very wealthy family, from a very prominent and respected family. And so this will be one of the factors that will shape him in his identity and who he is. And Bashir Nafi mentions this in his paper. There are multiple factors that shape Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. One of them is the aristocratic family that he emanated from. Also are things like the fact that the madrasa he studied at, the fact that nearly every single of his mashayikh was from the great Maliki Imams of his time. I think there was only one Hanafi teacher that he had. And also then the milieu of the reform that was taking place in the 20th century in the face of colonial tensions, of national tensions. All of these things made Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur who he was. And so we have his birth in 1879, his early education. He then enrolls at the Zaytuna University, and then he becomes, I think they call it mutatawi', if I'm saying it correctly, which is like the early, like an auxiliary teacher, like like a junior teacher, I think it is at the university. And over the years, he just climbs up the ranks all the way until he reaches the pinnacle of the educational hierarchy in Tunisia by becoming the Shaykh al-Islam, by becoming the Grand Mufti. He is the Grand Shaykh of the Zaytuna University, the Zaytuna Masjid, along, as far as I remember, being the first Maliki Shaykh al-Islam of Tunisia, which sounds like a quite remarkable thing because you'd assume Tunisia, being in North Africa, had always had a Maliki Shaykh al-Islam. But actually, until Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, the Shaykh al-Islam of Tunisia was a Hanafi. And that was because of their position as a land under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, obviously, the judicial system and the legal system there was run by the madhab of Imam al-A'zam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala. Therefore, until Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur's appointment, the Shaykh al-Islam of Tunisia would have been a Hanafi until his appointment, and he becomes the first Maliki Shaykh al-Islam. His family. His family, they say, are originally from Morocco, and they are from a very prominent Idrisid family in Morocco, they move from Andalus via Morocco into Tunisia. And the first of his ancestors is this figure, Muhammad ibn Abd, who, if I remember correctly, was a great Sufi, was a very pious person. Um, and so that was all they remember. That's what they mentioned about him, that he was a great Sufi personality, somebody who was known for his zuhud and his connection to the ways of tasawwuf. Who is more important is later, as we go down the generations, their scholarship starts to appear in the family of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. And actually, he has a grandfather called Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, who has the exact same name, who has quite famously a commentary on the Qasida Burda. And I know this because I bought this commentary on the Qasida Burda thinking, oh wow, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, the great Mufassir, has a commentary on the Qasida Burda. I can't wait to read it. Until I began to read it, and it was very clear this was not him. This was actually his grandfather. But at this moment in time, Turath Publishing are working to translate an abridged version of this Ibn Ashur commentary on the Qasida Burda. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them success. But his grandfather, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, who has the same name, is a Maliki Qadi. He's the chief, I think he's the chief Qadi of the Malikiya in Tunisia at that time. He holds a very, very prominent position, and he is a very, very powerful and resolute, confident scholar of the Maliki school, and you can see that here. And so he was somebody who always sort of stood on his own 2 feet, issued his own rulings, wasn't somebody who bowed to pressure around him, was famous for knowing his own mind and speaking his mind. Who is another quite interesting personality is his maternal grandfather, who, along with being a scholar of Islam, was also a quite prominent politician who worked within the Tunisian political system. It's very, I don't know, I'm not an expert on this historical period, but there is a dynasty, I don't know if it's the Hafsid dynasty, who rule, the Beys, Ahmed Bey, Ali Bey, who ruled Tunisia over the 19th century. And after a while, they come under French protection, or the French protectorate, and they come under French colonial control. They are, for a long time, sort of allied loosely to the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottomans don't really have a lot of control over North Africa by that time. And the French obviously start taking territory, Algeria being the most prominent place they take. And after a while, they also take control of Tunisia. And so this is the sort of period that Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, may Allah have mercy on him, grapples. And his grandfather would have also grappled with, being somebody who worked, I assume, with the original rulers of Tunisia, and then also having to work within the French colonial system. And his grandfather, his maternal grandfather, was a quite important person who worked within the Zaytuna University system, established schools, awqaf, organized Sharia courts, all of these things. He was somebody who worked within the bureaucracy. And so this was somebody who would have a seminal impact on Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur himself. And so, as they mention, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur is born in the palace of his maternal grandfather. And the house still exists today, and you can still go visit it, apparently. But the street that it's on is named after Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, the biographer mentions. His own children, this is Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur's children, he has a number of sons. The most prominent of them is the one mentioned at the bottom, Muhammad al-Fadil. He has a very important book on Quran exegesis, the different methodologies. I don't want to misquote the name, Al-Quran wal-Mufassirun or something like this, Al-Tafsir wal-Mufassirun. Muhammad al-Fadil ibn Ashur, may Allah have mercy on him, and Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, the great Imam, would remember him fondly and would speak quite highly of him. And he also had 2 daughters, but the creme de la creme of his children, or the one who carried on, in one sense, his legacy as a scholar of Islam, as a scholar of the Maliki school, as a scholar of Tafsir, as a scholar of Quran, was this son, Muhammad al-Fadil. May Allah have mercy on him, who also passed away, it seems, a few years before Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur did himself. His life in education will be spent predominantly under the influence of this Zaytuna University, not to be confused with the current Zaytuna University in California. This is the original university in Zaytuna in Tunis, and it is one of the 3 great North African Islamic institutions. Obviously, there are other Islamic institutions in West Africa and other places, but in North Africa, there are 3 prominent institutions. The most famous of them is obviously the University of Al-Azhar al-Sharif, which was founded by the Fatimids and later made Sunni by Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi and others, and is probably the most famous and most prominent Islamic institution of learning on this planet. The other of them is also Al-Qarawiyyin, which is in Morocco, founded, disputed. There is a dispute over who it was actually founded by, but quite famously, people claim at least, that it was founded by Fatima al-Fihriya, by a woman, and it is also one of the most prominent Islamic universities, one of the oldest universities in the world. But then you also have the Zaytuna University, and this is the university, this was, you can see actually in the history of the Zaytuna, that is founded very, very early on in the time of the Salaf, the early Muslim period. If you think about the fact that Imam Abu Hanifa, may Allah have mercy on him, is born in 80 Hijri and passes away in 150, you can see that there is something quite remarkable about the founding of this, that North Africa is conquered or invaded at least by the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, Ridwanullahi alayhim ajma'in. Uqba ibn Nafi' very prominently is one of the leaders of that conquest. And in that very early period, you see the foundation of this university, this institute of learning, the masjid, at least, if not like an institute of learning in a technical sense, the masjid, the Zaytuna Masjid is founded, and it models, apparently, I've never been, but it models the universities that were founded in North Africa at that time. But then you also have, later, it goes through a whole period of different reforms, comes under Ottoman control, there's declines, there's resurgences, and it has its own very unique history. But all we need to cover at this point is that this is one of the most formidable early Islamic institutions of religious learning. And this is the institution that will shape, in every sense of the word, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur in his life, because this is the university he studies at, this is the university he graduates from, this is the university he teaches at, this is the masjid where he becomes the Grand Sheikh of, and this is the university that he will be associated with from the very early period of his learning all the way up until his death. May Allah have mercy on him. This is from Google, and this is a picture of the university. It's a very nice picture, to be honest. You can see all the birds in the courtyard, and you can see the architecture and a beautiful, beautiful blue sky. And may Allah give us the tawfiq to visit this place and to take benefit from its mashayikh and the great imams of learning and the great saints and awliya that are inevitably buried in the vicinity of this noble, noble, sacred place. Very good. Okay, so this is now the Zaytuna itself. What is very interesting is that just before the time of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, and even in his lifetime, it's a time of great reform. It's a time of great modernization. You have the Emir of Tunisia understanding that there is a threat from the French, that there has to be a mobilization. Algeria is falling or is going to fall. Therefore, we have to now mobilize our own defenses and protect ourselves. And in the process of doing so, we have to make sure that we have a modernized military system, a modernized educational system, a modernized legal system. And so the Zaytuna University is not immune to the modernization that's going on in the Islamic world in the 19th and 20th century. There will be a modernization attempt by Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur himself when he is the dean or the head of the university. But there are also other reform attempts that take place just before his arrival. And so this is the educational structure that he will be part of when he joins the university. That there's a split, and this is famously known about Tunisia or Zaytuna before the changes that come later in the life of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, that there is a 50-50 between the Malikis and the Hanafis. Because of the Ottoman influence, the Hanafis have a very prominent position. The Shaykh al-Islam of Tunisia is a Hanafi, but there are obviously, because it's North Africa, the Malikis also hold prominent positions. And then you have three tiers of professorship. Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur will go through all three tiers to become like a head professor or the highest tier professor at the university. Also, the program itself will have three levels of instruction, the primary level, intermediate level, and then the advanced level. There's 7 years of education that will take place. And then at the end, there is an examination. You have, along with some form of written examination, something that we don't see much anymore, is the idea of the oral examination. Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur will be tested in an oral examination by his teachers on various questions, on various books. Some madrasas still maintain this, but obviously now we live in an age where everything is now written. In the examination systems, everything is considered written. But even Azhar and other universities in this period, they would have done a lot of their examinations orally. And only in, I think, the early 20th century even did Azhar reform its educational system so that the exams became written exams. And this is maybe due to modern influence and educational changes that were taking place in the world. And it has a comprehensive curriculum. We'll look in a little bit more detail at the curriculum that Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur would have studied. But you obviously have the various ulum of Arabic, you have fiqh, aqidah, logic, history, geography, mathematics, astronomy, all of the sciences that the Muslims would have been studying at that time, all going to be studied by Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur himself as well. Okay. Now, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, may Allah have mercy on him, he actually starts studying quite early on in his life. And he studies in sort of in the local area, like many of the mashayikh did before they went and studied further at more prominent Islamic institutions. So he memorizes the Quran when he's 6 years old in a masjid near his home. He then, after that, starts the basic mutun, the texts. He studies the Matan of Ibn Ashir, which, if you're Maliki, you know about better than I do. And then he obviously studies the Al-Ajrumiyya, and he studies various Arabic grammar texts, and he studies French because obviously there's this French influence at that period. So all of this, he starts off by studying the more basic ulum Islamiyya locally. And at the age of 14, it seems, he moves to the Zaytuna University, which is a place really at that time the more aristocratic. You had to really be a person of high value, authority, from a respected family in order to even get admission into the university. Only later does it become a bit more democratic and egalitarian in its admissions process. But generally at that time, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, because of who his grandfather was, because of who his great grandfather, the original founding member of the family, and also the fact that his maternal grandfather is this very famous political figure who was working with Khairuddin al-Tunisi, who was a very famous Tunisian reformer, who was also I think the prime minister at one point of Tunisia, and also became the Grand Vizier and the Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And so his grandfather, his family is really rubbing shoulders with aristocrats and very prominent, important people. So this means Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur will obviously find his way into the most prominent, the Oxfords even, of Tunisia, which is the Zaytuna University. And there he will study a variety of different Islamic sciences. We'll look at them in a second. But these are some of the names of his mashayikh. And so let's look at them quite quickly. They say that of all of his mashayikh, if I can find their names, I have a document on the side that I'm looking at for further details. There is only one of them who is considered to be a Hanafi Imam. Apart from that, nearly 10, I think he has around 12 teachers, something like this, 12 prominent teachers. The majority of them are Malikiyah. And so the prominent teachers that they mentioned are people like the Sheikh here, Salim Buhajib, may Allah have mercy on him, who is also a Tunisian Sheikh, and also has quite prominent political appointments and things like this as well. He's also a very reformist scholar. They say one of the things he did as an act of reform was introduce Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah to the curriculum. He's also a founder of this thing called the Khalduniya Society, which is there trying to carry out educational reform, rethinking how things are done, how we must approach things philosophically. Um, the necessity of using more practical sciences and actually introducing students to a lot of the changes that are happening in the modern world. He's also somebody who has a journal, journal articles and magazines and all these things. So he's somebody who's quite adept in dealing with the way the modern world is moving. And he also teaches the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari and the Muwatta of Malik. And so this is what Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur would have studied with him, and he gave him ijaza amma in all of the sciences. And this is probably one of his most influential, if not the most influential of his mashayikh. The next person, the next sheikh is Umar ibn al-Sheikh. And this is somebody who was a master of the rational sciences, a master of the sciences of kalam, the ulum aqliya, and he taught books on logic, he taught books on usul al-fiqh, like the commentaries on the Jam' al-Jawami', he taught books on kalam, he taught books on Maliki fiqh as well. He taught him, they say, also the tafsir of Imam al-Baydawi, and this is somebody who had an incredible influence on Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. He took ijazah from him. They say that the Sheikh studied with him the Mawaqif of Al-Iji, which is a very prominent Kalam text, and also the Tafsir of Baydawi. And so this is maybe where Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur gets his early glimpses into the world of tafsir, where he is going to become one of the great masters himself, rahimahullah ta'ala. But this is one of the great mashayikh that he has. Another great mashayikh or great sheikh that he has is Muhammad al-Nakhli. And what's very, very prominent about him is not just that he was a considerable, like a good scholar, but also that he was somebody who was heavily affected by the reformism of Muhammad Abdu. And they say Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, this may have been his avenue into the world of reform. When Muhammad Abdu was coming in, he was there changing him and his student Rashid Rida under the influence of colonial control of Egypt. Azhar University went through this very strange phase where a lot of things were being rejected. Miracles suddenly became problematic. There was this positivism and scientific, philosophical naturalism, and all of these things were starting to heavily affect the ulama of Azhar. They started denying certain realities that Muslims had taken for granted for centuries, and this became a big fitna, really, that the ulama had to deal with at that time. And one of the spearheads of that is Muhammad Abdu. Now, we can assume that Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur was not affected by the more extreme views of Muhammad Abdu, but there were definitely something of his reformism did touch Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, and that is why we even have accounts. Bashir Nafi' mentions that he wrote for, I think, the Manar of Rashid Rida in defense of Rashid Rida's fatwa, but he did it anonymously because he didn't want any controversy. Because this was a thing known about the Shaykh, that he was somebody who shied away from controversy. Actually, he didn't want to antagonize people politically. He didn't want to cause issues. He didn't want to ruffle feathers. And especially near the end of his life, he sort of just stepped away from all of the public hullabaloo that he was being embroiled in and just focused on teaching and writing. But we know that in his early studying period, he was affected by the views of Muhammad Abdu, who we, in our own understanding, we take the position of the teacher of our teachers, Sheikh Mustafa Sabri, may Allah have mercy on him, who wrote scathing refutations of Muhammad Abdu, who held very, very heretical views without a shadow of a doubt. But there were obviously some parts of his reform that the ulama may be deemed palatable, and this is what Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur would have been affected by, hopefully. Another famous student of Muhammad al-Nakhli is Abdul Hamid ibn Badis, the famous Algerian anti-colonial warrior, who is also a student of the great Shaykh al-Islam Maulana Hussein Ahmad Madani. May Allah have mercy on all of them. The next Shaykh that we will mention here, and the final one on this list, because we're only going to go through some examples, there's a longer list that you can find in the work that we mentioned at the beginning, is Muhammad Salih al-Sharif. He's from Algeria originally. He taught, obviously, at Zaytuna, but he was also somebody who studied in Damascus, he studied in Istanbul. He was somebody who we would say was a much more traditional scholar, somebody who wasn't reforming, wasn't engaging. So even like Muhammad Umar ibn al-Shaykh, who is somebody, so you can even see in this list that we have, the short list, Salim Buhajib and Muhammad al-Nakhli are more reformists, but Umar ibn al-Shaykh and Muhammad Salih al-Sharif would have been more traditionalist scholars. And this was somebody, they say about Muhammad Salih al-Sharif, he was somebody who did not like Hafiz ibn Taymiyyah. He disputed, he had scholarly debates with Abdu and Rida, who were trying to revive the way of Ibn Taymiyyah, and actually were seen in Tunisia at that time by many of the traditionalist scholars as Wahhabis, because it was seen that they were trying to promote Wahhabism through the lens of Ibn Taymiyyah. Whatever the case may be, the Shaykh Muhammad Salih al-Sharif, what he influenced Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur very strongly is his teaching of the Kashaf of Zamakhshari, the famous Mu'tazilite Mufassir, who wrote arguably the one. There is not a Mufassir except they are affected by Zamakhshari, and they rely on him in some way, shape, or form, either trying to correct some of his positions. I think I heard one of the Mashayikh say the Baydawi is just a Sunni version or Sunni attempt to sanitize the Kashaf of Zamakhshari. But there's no denying he was one of the greatest mufassirun and a great scholar of Islam, rahimahullah ta'ala, in spite of some of his views that he held, that many, many, many mashayikh, much more senior than we will ever be, obviously refuted him on. Nevertheless, this was somebody whose approach to tafsir heavily affected Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, may Allah have mercy on him, and we will look at his tafsir very briefly at one point when we go through some of the books the Shaykh wrote. And so these are some of the more prominent teachers that he had. What did he study in Zaytuna? This is just a list of the sciences. He would have studied tafsir. We have the books. He would have studied in these various ulum for the tullab al-ilm who might benefit from it. He would have studied the tafsir of Imam al-Baydawi. He studied the tafsir of Imam of Zamakhshari. He studied hadith, the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari. He studied the Muwatta of Imam Malik. He studied various Sunan collections. He studied the Bayquniya in Usul al-Hadith. He also studied Kalam. He studied the Sharh of Imam Sa'duddin al-Taftazani on the Aqaid al-Nasafiyah. He studied the Mawaqif of Al-Iji, the Wusta. I think this would be of Sanusi in Aqidah as well. In fiqh, he would have studied the great books of the Maliki school, the books of the Dir. I have no idea. I'm just reading a list now because I know nothing about. But the Risale ibn Abi Zayd, I do know what that is. He would have studied the commentaries on that. He would have studied the Mukhtasar Khalil, which we hear is the equivalent of the Hidayah in the Maliki school. And this would be Zurqani's commentary on the Mukhtasar Khalil, and I assume that's a very, very important and prominent book. He would have studied Usul al-Fiqh, the Shar al-Mahalli on the Jam' al-Jawami', I think this is of a Subki, the Hattab on the Waraqat of al-Juwayni, and other books he would have studied. He studied Sirah. People don't know, but Ibn Ashur has writings on the Sirah. Most of them are articles that have been compiled into a standalone book, which is basically the Mawlid of Ibn Ashur that you can buy as a standalone book, and you can find the PDF as well. He studied in logic the Sulam and the Tahdhib, and then various texts in grammar, the works of Shaykh Khalid al-Azhari, the Qatr al-Nada of Ibn Hisham, the Lamiyat al-Af'al, etc., etc., all of these books. And then he studied, very interestingly, a lot in Balagha. He has a text in Balagha, we'll look at that later, the Mujaz al-Balagha, but he studied the Mukhtasar al-Ma'ani of Sa'duddin al-Taftazani, the Mutawwal again of Sa'duddin al-Taftazani, um, the Talkhis, he studied the Miftah by Sakkaki, he studied books of Imam al-Baqillani and Jurjani and others who wrote on the I'jaz al-Quran specifically as well. And then he also would have studied French, and we've discussed this already, and that would have been what would have taken him to graduation to obtain the Tatwi' certificate that would have meant that he was a scholar, a sheikh. And so, I don't know if the next part is the Tatwi' exam. No, it's not. These are students. Before we get to students, he actually takes the examination in 1899 on the Rabiul Awwal the 4th, and this was a new format that they were using in order to carry out this examination. And he was asked to take an oral exam and teach a lesson from the Mukhtasar of Sa'duddin al-Taftazani on Balagha. And when he finished, the certificate showed that he was somebody who exceeded expectations. And actually, they say about Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, even though, even a scholar of his caliber, it was still immensely surprising to see the way he climbed the ranks of the scholarly class of Tunisia and reached the apex of where he finally did. Like he was a brilliant, he was a genius, but even by those standards, he was still so remarkable. And various mashayikh sign off. Muhammad Bayram, I don't know if this is the Grand Mufti of the Malikiya, who is later going to have a sort of falling out with, but it may have been so. From the mashayikh, from the students that he had, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, one of the things about Zaytuna, by the time Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur Shaykh becomes a teacher there, is that it becomes a hotbed for the independence movement and the attempt to build a Tunisian national identity. And so many of the students of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur are known for being very prominent nationalists, very, very important freedom fighters, being very important people engaging in work, defending the Islamic tradition, etc., etc. And so we'll go through this list that we have here. There's a longer list, obviously, they can find in the books, but this is Sheikh Muhammad al-Shadili al-Nayfar, rahimahullah ta'ala. He obviously studies at Zaytuna. He is a nationalist activist, and he has to flee from the colonial powers in order to save his own life. He later becomes the dean of Zaytuna College himself, and he's known for being one of the most prominent, a very prominent scholar of Tunisia. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on him. We spoke about Abdul Hamid ibn Badis. This is somebody who's heavily influenced by both Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur and Muhammad al-Nakhli, these sort of more reformist type scholars. And he is obviously a very famous Algerian reformer nationalist who people still speak about today. Another famous student of his is Muhammad al-Eid al-Khalifa, who is a very famous poet, apparently, who writes a lot of poetry and is part of the Renaissance of Islam in Algeria and reviving the Arabic language and all of these things. Another student, Abu Hassan ibn Sha'ban, and you have the list in front of you and you can just look at it for yourselves. Okay, now here is where it gets more interesting. Just to mention, just before we carry on, because I have it here in front of me now, At-Tafsir wa Rijaluhu is the book by Muhammad al-Fadil ibn Ashur, the very famous book that a lot of people recommend and comes highly, highly regarded. What are the books that Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur himself taught at Zaytuna when he was a teacher there? He taught Asrar al-Balagha and Dalail al-I'jaz by Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani. May Allah have mercy on him. One of the two very prominent works in the development of the science of Balagha itself through the Quran, and also two very prominent works defending the Balagha of the Quran, the I'jaz of the Quran, the miraculous nature of the language of the Quran. And this will obviously play a massive role in the tafsir that Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, may Allah have mercy on him, will write. The Sharh al-Mutawwal of At-Taftazani, like we mentioned before, and this is his very long commentary in a work. It's a work in rhetoric. Again, the fact that he's teaching these sciences is where a lot of the Arabic engagement that the tafsir is going to do, a lot of that is being grounded in this moment, because they mention about Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanwi, I'll just mention briefly, that somebody asked him once, how do you have so much grounding in the ulum Islamiyah that you're able to just quote books and actually have just this very deep understanding of all of the different ulum Islami at one moment, that you can just mobilize all of them to answer one question from all these different angles. And he said, it's the time I spent teaching in Kanpur, that I spent time in the madrasa, and I was there for whatever time, 20 years, 14 years, whatever it was, and it gave me the grounding that now these, because that's what teaching does. Teaching solidifies your understanding of concepts. It forces you to put things together. It forces you to be able to present those ideas, to make other people understand them. And so it solidifies everything you know. And it allows you to link things together in ways that you would never have imagined beforehand. And so Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, the fact he's teaching all of this is just mobilizing and just transforming him even psychologically into somebody who, when he later writes the tafsir, he's able to just create things and put forward things and engage with things in unprecedented ways. He also teaches works in Usul al-Fiqh. He teaches the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun, which is obviously a very prominent work in the rise and fall of civilizations. And Ibn Ashur has a work, Usul al-Nizam al-Ijtima'i fil Islam, I think it's called. We'll look at it later, the principles of social order within Islam. He teaches the Muwatta of Malik. Again, this idea that, they always talk about him as a mufassir and as a reformist scholar and as a scholar of language, but he was also somebody who engaged with hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. He teaches the Diwan al-Hamasa, which is a work in Arabic poetry, sort of chivalric poetry. So he's obviously accessing classical Arabic literature, and we'll talk about this later as well. And he would also after the Taraweeh prayer in Ramadan, he would teach hadith to the masses. I'm assuming that people would just come and he would have a public dars on hadith that people could attend. Um, what are the reforms that he carried out as the head of Zaytuna? I don't know how he's got to the head, but we'll talk about that later. He divides education into three stages. He changes lesson length time because he feels the current system of 3 hour classes, 3 hour lessons, if you can imagine, is too long. And so he changes that to an hour. Each class has to be an hour. It's just more regimented. He starts to regiment, more controlled, more systematized. Um, appointing specific subjects and teachers for each term, specific lesson times for each subject, and also a general supervisor for oversight. And you can just see it's sort of, it's just modernizing. It's just refining the system to make sure everything runs smoothly, creating efficiency, which everybody sees as like these evil colonial things that white people did to Muslim lands. But in some sense, these are things that Muslims needed at that time because things were all over the place, maybe. And so Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur comes in. He fixes times, he fixes teachers, he fixes timetables. He makes sure, if you've ever been to a madrasa, these things are quite important. There's always the teachers who run over, there's always the teachers who take extra time, but he decides to make things more systematic, more rational, more controlled. And he would also have a policy, I think it's going to come up here, maybe. Yes, that he himself, he would have a supervisor that when it was time to finish the lesson, the teacher would remind him, or the supervisor would remind him that the class is over now and it's time for you to go. And so he would finish his lesson and he would recite the Fatiha and he would leave. Because many a teacher maybe would just sit in the lesson and just wait and keep going, but he would have his time set down to a T, very punctual with his time and how he would teach. And this ruffled feathers. Now, there's going to be a lot of things that he does in reform within Zaytuna that people are not going to like. And so, because of this, he's going to have certain issues and certain problems with with other teachers, with more traditional scholars who don't like the work that he's carrying out. And there is going to be some controversy. And we're going to look at some of that controversy later on, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But the point here is just to show that these are some of the reforms he carried out once he became the head of Zaytuna University himself. Okay. We might just do a couple more slides and then we'll call this the first session. And then we'll do the rest of his biography in another session. What is very interesting is the period. We spoke about this quite briefly, but we're going to come back to this later as well. The historical context, what's happening in Tunisia at that time that Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur would have been engaging with as a teacher, as a student, as somebody who rises up the ranks of educational service, becomes the head of the university. So like we mentioned, in the 19th century, you have Ahmed Bey, who carries out these reforms. Now, the reforms are done primarily in the face of French incursion. The French are now in North Africa. They are trying to engage or take over Muslim lands and then carry out their own reform attempts. And the only way we can stop them is that we have to discipline the army. We have to create systems by which everything runs in a coordinated, orderly fashion. We have to modernize the army. We have to modernize the military weapons that we use, the military techniques that are used. We have to remove certain more archaic policies. And so you have the abolition of slavery and these things, and they develop constitutions. So these are just mirroring a lot of things that are happening in the Ottoman lands, anyways, with the Tanzimat reforms and the Gulhani edicts and all of those other fun things that our teacher, Dr. Yaqub Ahmed, talks about. And then they also have a constitution and the constitutional crisis, which was his PhD thesis. Nevertheless, the Tunisians are also going through this process of reform, attempted modernization, pushback from certain more entrenched parties who don't like the changes that are being made. A very prominent person is the reformist scholar Khairuddin at-Tunisi, who is who has Islamic leanings, who also tries to mobilize the ulama to support his efforts, who tries to paint all of his reformist efforts in this sort of veneer of Islamic reform, Islamic revivalism. But ultimately, it seems he's not very, very successful. And then he later leaves Tunisia and he makes his way. And I think in 1978, 1878 even, he becomes the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire under the rulership of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. But this is also not very successful, and about after a year he's deposed or removed, or I don't know what happens with him. And he later leaves. He also has writings on like a travelogue and all of these different reflections. And Bashir Nafi' speaks about this in his paper on Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. But he's a quite prominent reformist person who's trying to switch up the systems in Tunisia that are running at that time. However, by 1881, the French take control of Tunisia. The French protectorate is established, and the education system is now under the control. There's a name of a guy, Michel something or the other, who tries to take control of the education system. The education system in Tunisia is just like most Islamic lands. They have the Katatib or the Kutab. These are like these primary schools. So the French set up their own equivalent parallel education system in order to secularize education, to remove the religious influence, because all of education was basically under religious influence. And then ultimately Zaytuna falls under, they says indirect state supervision, but it has a level of French oversight now. And this is going to play a big part in Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur's own time at the university, and his engagement with the French and engagement with reformists and engagement with those people who are trying to push back the nationalists, the independence-minded people as well. Our final slide for this session, and we'll come back to this probably in the next session. Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, what is his actual time or the lifespan in Zaytuna? And we're following the book, by the way. This is why you might feel disjointed, and maybe I should have done it more chronologically, but this is following the Arabic book that we mentioned right at the beginning. So as we remember, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, born in 1879, so he's 20 years old when he graduates. Remember, he joined Zaytuna when he's about 13, 14, 7-year program. He graduates in 1899, and then he begins teaching. And he graduates in the early stage, the Tatwi' certificate, the early stage certificate. And he starts teaching. He's like a beginner teacher. I don't know what the equivalent, like without his ECT maybe, and he's just got his PGC or something. But he starts teaching at Zaytuna. He then, 4 years later, he takes his teaching examinations and gets put to the intermediate level. He replaces his own Sheikh, Muhammad al-Nakhli, who is now promoted to the first level. In 1905, which is obviously here, he is appointed to be a member of the board of directors for the Khalduniya Society, which we remember was founded by his teacher, Salih Hajib. He then also takes the examination to be promoted to the first tier teacher. He has an oral exam on Bay al-Khiyar, and then he is promoted and becomes a high level, the first level teacher in the Zaytuna University. And then until 1923 and 24, he has a variety of different things. He's members of different committees, he writes reports, he proposes educational reform in various places. He becomes a member of the Council of Schools. I'm just going through the list here. And then in 1913, he becomes a Maliki judge in the Sharia Council. He also becomes a Mufti. In 1923, so yes, this is where he becomes the deputy to the Sheikh Bash Mufti. Now, what the Bash Mufti is that the Grand Mufti or the Sheikh al-Islam is a Hanafi. And the Maliki Mufti was called Mufti Bash or Bash Mufti or something like this. This is the name, apparently. And so he is the deputy to the Grand Maliki Mufti of Tunisia. And then later he becomes the head of the Muftis, the head of the Maliki Muftis in 1924. Okay, so originally he's just a junior deputy mufti, the deputy to the Grand Mufti, then he becomes the Grand Mufti himself. He then goes through various other stages until 1932, 1933, he becomes the Shaykh al-Islam of the Malikiyah. And he's the first Maliki Shaykh al-Islam. The Shaykh al-Islam would have always been a Hanafi up until this point. He doesn't just become the Grand Shaykh al-Islam of the Malikiyah in Tunisia, he also becomes the Shaykh of the great mosque here being the Masjid of Zaytuna. And so he combines these two seminal, powerful, leading positions of scholarship in 1932. So he would have been about 50 years old, rahimahullah ta'ala. No, maybe less. No, 50 years old. That's my maths. It's good. 1879, it was basically 1880 to 1932. That's about 50 years. And he only holds this position for about a year and a half. And they say here that his son, Fadil ibn Ashur, considered his appointment a victory for the student movement and the reformist movement, those who wanted change, those who wanted to see the implementation of educational policy changes, to see philosophical changes in the curriculum, to see things actually updated, to be able to contend with issues that people were dealing with in the modern world. However, after a year and a half, he is removed from his position over the scandal. There's a variety of scandals. Now, one of them is the reforms that he's proposing. People are uncomfortable with them. People don't like change. And also, he has this fatwa on naturalization, which we're going to talk about later. But he gives this fatwa on this issue. There's a big issue that kicks off on naturalization. I think it is on one of the later slides. So I won't talk about it now. We'll come back to it later. But some of his own teachers oppose him. Some of the more traditional teachers, like Salih al-Sharif and Muhammad Bayram, who gave him ijazah, who took his exams, they will oppose him and they will remove him. And I think Muhammad Bayram was the Hanafi Shaykh al-Islam who was demoted to put Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur in position. And so obviously he also might have felt, Allahu Alam, I don't want to make any aspersions on any great ulama, but that might have had an effect in his decision to help remove Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur from his position. However, 12 years later, he comes back into that position again as the Sheikh of the Zaytuna University, and then he will hold his position of the Sheikh of Zaytuna and the Maliki Sheikh al-Islam up until 1960. And then I assume this is the point where he steps away from public life and removes himself from a lot of the position and authority that he had. Inshallah ta'ala, that is going to be the first half of our look into the life of the great Imam Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. May Allah have mercy on him. We spoke about his origins, we spoke about some of his family members, we spoke about some of his children, we spoke about his mashayikh, we spoke about the curriculum he would have studied, we spoke about some of his students, we spoke about Zaytuna University and the influence it would have had on him. And we also spoke about his position rising up the ranks as a genius, brilliant scholar within the university at Zaytuna. And inshallah ta'ala, we'll carry on looking at him in more detail in our next session. And at some point, we'll also start the tafsir that we're going to be reading together. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be people who follow in the footsteps of the great ulama of the past, to be people who inherit the prophetic inheritance and no other inheritance, because that is the only inheritance that is worth inheriting. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send abundant salutations upon our Master Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, to protect Tunisia from those who wish it evil. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fill that land with justice, to fill it with mercy. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect all the lands of Islam, especially Gaza and Quds and Sudan, which we're hearing very, very horrific things about at the moment. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect our brothers and sisters in all the places that they exist. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to cast His protective shield over the Ummah of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And inshallah ta'ala, I will see you for the next session where we will look in more detail further at the life of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, Shaykh al-Islam of the Malikiyah of the 20th century. Rahimahullah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.